Tonight, we step into the quiet, dimly lit corners of the medieval world. Imagine yourself lying down on a bed of straw, bundled in a thin blanket, listening to the distant sounds of a village winding down for the night. The year is 1325. The flickering light of tallow candles casts uneven shadows across wooden beams. Outside, the streets are silent except for the shuffle of a late-night watchman or the bark of a stray dog. It is here, in this time and place, that we begin with the very first moment of life, birth. Birth in the medieval world was not the hopeful, medically supported event we often picture today. It was dangerous, it was uncertain, and above all, it was one of the earliest reasons why being a woman in the Middle Ages was so difficult. For women, the act of bringing new life into the world was also one of the most common ways they lost their own. And for newborn girls, survival was a matter of chance stacked against them from the start. The odds of surviving infancy in medieval Europe were brutally low. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 children never made it to their 5th birthday. Disease, poor sanitation, and malnutrition claimed countless young lives. For a baby girl, the situation could be even more precarious. Families under strain sometimes prioritized boys over girls, because sons were seen as future laborious heirs or protectors. A daughter might still be cherished, but the economic weight of raising her could feel like a burden to parents who lived on the edge of poverty. To understand this, picture the cramped cottage of a peasant family. The walls are made of wattle and daub, patched with straw and mud. The smoke from the hearth fills the air because there is no chimney, only a hole in the roof. On a bed of straw lies a mother, exhausted from hours of labor without any real medical aid. Around her are women from the village, older midwives who rely on herbal knowledge and whispered prayers more than on science. If the baby cries, relief washes through the room. But that cry is just the beginning of a long and uncertain battle against the world. Infant mortality was not only about disease or hunger. Sometimes, it was about choices made under pressure. There were cases where unwanted children, especially girls, were abandoned or left to die quietly. While not the rule, such practices happened in times of famine, when there was simply not enough food to go around. The church officially condemned infanticide, but desperation in the countryside did not always leave room for moral guidance. In wealthier families, daughters were more secure, but even then, their lives were shaped by expectations of future marriages and dowries. From the very first breath, a girl's worth was tied to what she might bring to her family later on. Consider also the lack of basic medical understanding. Midwives used herbs like pennyroyal or rue, not always safely, in attempts to help with childbirth. The concept of germs, infection, or sterile tools was centuries away. A simple cut could fester and kill. A complication during delivery, something we would handle with surgery today, was often fatal. So, for a medieval woman, giving birth was both duty and gamble. Each child meant the survival of the family line, but also the risk of leaving that family behind in grief. For the child itself, survival depended heavily on feeding. Breastfeeding was expected, of course, but not every mother was able. Some turned to wet nurses, especially in noble households, but in poor families, this was rarely an option. If the mother died in childbirth, the baby's chances dropped even further. Substitutes like animal milk were sometimes used, but these were unsafe and lacked nutrition. Infections, diarrhea, or simple weakness could take a life in days. Sanitation added to the struggle. Most people lived in villages where waste was thrown into pits or ditches. Water sources were easily contaminated. A baby crawling on a dirt floor might be exposed to parasites without anyone knowing why. Sickness followed. Fevers were seen as a mystery, not as signs of treatable conditions. People prayed, applied poultices, or relied on charms, but cures were elusive. The tiniest illness could spiral into tragedy. Even in noble castles, conditions were not much safer. Wealthier families could afford better food, but medical knowledge was still the same. Doctors trained in humoral theory prescribed bleeding or bizarre mixtures that often harmed more than they helped. A noble daughter was more likely to survive than a peasant one, but she was not immune to the ever-present dangers of medieval life. Smallpox, dysentery, and plague did not respect wealth. And when epidemics swept through towns, children, especially girls, were often the first lost. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the cultural reality of being born female. The birth of a boy might be celebrated with more joy, sometimes even with feasts or special prayers. The birth of a girl, while still meaningful, was often accompanied by a quiet sigh of practicality. Parents already knew what lay ahead: years of work, preparation for marriage, and the weight of dowries. From the start, a girl was seen less as an independent future and more as a connection to another family. If a girl survived infancy, her early years were marked by constant vulnerability. Diseases like measles and whooping cough, which circulate even in modern times, could sweep through villages unchecked. Without vaccinations, they were often fatal. Accidents were another danger. With open fires, sharp tools, and animals nearby, it was easy for a child to be burned, bitten, or crushed. And since medical help was scarce, even minor injuries could turn deadly. The broader environment also worked against survival. Famines were frequent. When harvests failed due to bad weather, locusts, or war, the poor starved first. Children, with their small bodies and limited reserves, often died in large numbers during these periods. Chronic malnutrition weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses fatal. In such times, families had to make impossible choices about how to distribute what little food they had. A son who could work in the fields might get more than a daughter who was still small and dependent. This paints a grim picture, but it is essential to understanding why being a medieval woman was so difficult. From birth, the odds were against survival. And even if a girl did live, she grew up knowing that her existence was less valued by many in her community. Her life was expected to be one of service, work, and obedience. The miracle was not that so many struggled, but that so many endured despite it all. When we think of history, we often imagine castles, knights, and royal feasts. But the daily reality of birth and survival for medieval women was something entirely different. It was harsh, unforgiving, and deeply unfair. The story of their lives begins in those moments of uncertainty at birth, and it never really lets go. Every milestone was shadowed by risk. Every day was a reminder of how fragile existence could be. And so, as you drift further into this story tonight, let your mind settle on the quiet truth that the women of the Middle Ages lived lives shaped by struggle from the very first breath. They carried the weight of survival in a world that gave them little choice and little safety. Their story, beginning at birth, sets the stage for everything that followed, from childhood to marriage, from labor to old age, if they ever reached it. If a medieval girl survived the dangerous first years of life, she would grow into childhood under conditions that might feel shockingly harsh by our standards today. Childhood was not seen as a special protected stage of life. It was not filled with toys, school lessons, or carefree exploration. Instead, childhood was a brief and fragile passage, quickly giving way to labor, responsibility, and expectations. For girls especially, this transition came early and it came heavy. Imagine a village in the countryside. The houses are small, built from timber, mud, and straw. The paths between them are muddy, uneven, and often littered with waste. In such a place, a little girl's daily world is defined less by play and more by work. By the time she can walk steadily, she already has tasks to perform. The medieval household simply cannot afford to let any member remain idle. One of the first responsibilities for young girls was helping with siblings. Large families were common, though many children did not live to adulthood. Older girls were expected to watch over babies and toddlers, keeping them out of harm's way while mothers worked. This might mean carrying an infant on her hip for hours, or making sure a younger child stayed close to the hearth without falling into the fire. Accidents happened often, and when they did, the blame frequently fell on the girl who was tasked with watching. Carrying water was another early duty. water was not piped into homes. Instead, it came from wells, rivers, or communal fountains. Girls, even at very young ages, carried buckets or jugs. The weight was significant, and the walk could be long, but it was considered part of learning responsibility. This daily chore not only demanded physical strength but also exposed girls to danger. At wells and rivers, slips and drownings were not uncommon. But the work still had to be done, day after day. Fire was central to medieval life, and managing it was another duty girls learned early. Keeping the fire lit in the hearth was essential for cooking and warmth. A girl might be told to tend the embers, blow on coals, or fetch kindling. The risks of burns were constant. Clothing could catch fire in an instant. Yet, these dangers were simply part of ordinary life, and girls were expected to cope. In addition to these core household duties, girls were introduced to food preparation from a very young age. They helped grind grain into flour using heavy hand-turned querns. They learned to knead dough, stir pottage in cauldrons, and preserve food for winter. These tasks were repetitive, slow, and physically demanding. Grinding grain, for instance, could take hours each day, and it was often done by women and their daughters. By involving girls early, mothers ensured the skills were passed on and that work was shared. Weaving and spinning were also essential roles. A girl might first be given a small spindle to practice twisting wool into thread. She would sit near her mother or grandmother, watching and imitating. Spinning was so central to female identity that the word distaff became shorthand for women in general. From childhood onward, girls were tied to the distaff, the symbol of their domestic labor. The hours spent spinning were long, and the work monotonous, but it was unavoidable. For poorer families, girls were sometimes sent to serve in wealthier households as maids or helpers. This could happen as early as age 7. In such settings, they cleaned, cooked, fetched, and obeyed the orders of adults who were not their parents. The work might be harsh, but it provided food and shelter, and sometimes small wages or clothing. For many families, this arrangement was a survival strategy, one less mouth to feed at home. For the girl, however, it meant an early separation from her family and the burden of adult duties before she was even grown. The idea of childhood play did exist, but it was not the priority. Some toys were simple, wooden dolls, carved animals, or rough balls made from leather and straw. Children sometimes played games outside, chasing each other or singing rhymes. But such play was short-lived and often interrupted by work. Adults rarely viewed play as essential. If there was free time, it was to be filled with productive tasks or with learning prayers and church teachings. Education for girls was limited. In most villages, formal schooling did not exist at all. A boy might learn basic letters if he was destined for the church, but girls almost never had this chance. Instead, their education was practical and domestic. They were taught to cook, clean, spin, weave, and obey. In rare cases, noble or wealthy merchant daughters might be educated at home by tutors. They could learn to read, sometimes even to write, especially if they were destined for convent life. But for the majority of medieval girls, literacy was out of reach. Their learning was rooted in chores, not books. Religion shaped much of childhood. Girls were expected to attend church services with their families. They memorized prayers and absorbed sermons that emphasized obedience and humility. The church reinforced the idea that women were weaker, more sinful, and in need of guidance from men. These messages sank in early, framing how girls saw themselves and how others saw them. Even games sometimes carried religious overtones, reminding children that their lives were to be lived under constant moral watch. Discipline was strict. Parents did not hesitate to punish children with physical means. Beatings and harsh words were common methods of control. For girls, the discipline was also about preparing them to be obedient wives and mothers. They were scolded for speaking out of turn, for failing at chores, or for disobedience. Silence, modesty, and service were praised as virtues. Through daily correction, girls learned the roles they were expected to carry for life. The social hierarchy was reinforced even in play. Boys might be allowed to run freer, play with wooden swords, or pretend at hunting. Girls, meanwhile, were often told to imitate their mothers, caring for dolls as if they were babies, or pretending to cook. Even make-believe prepared them for the duties they would soon assume in reality. Childhood was never an escape from gender roles, it was training ground for them. The contrast with modern childhood is stark. Today we imagine childhood as a period of growth, curiosity, and discovery. In the Middle Ages, it was compressed, shortened, and dominated by survival. For girls, it was not a time of dreaming about the future, but a steady march toward it, filled with practice in domestic skills and constant reminders of submission. And yet, despite the hardships, children found moments of joy. Singing songs together, chasing each other through fields, or listening to folk tales told by parents at night gave small sparks of warmth. But those sparks were brief, and they flickered against a backdrop of labor and responsibility. By the age of 12, many girls were already treated as women, ready for betrothal or service outside the home. Childhood, as we understand it, barely existed. For medieval women, then, the hardships began long before adulthood. From the first steps they took, they carried the weight of work and the expectations of family and society. Every bucket of water, every hour spent spinning, every chore was a reminder their lives were not their own to shape freely. They were being prepared for roles set long before they were born. So as you imagine yourself drifting back into this world tonight, see the small figure of a girl carrying wood through a muddy lane. She is barely 10 years old, but already she moves with the tired determination of someone much older. Her hands are rough, her back sore, but she does not complain. This is life, and she has no reason to expect anything different. For her, childhood is simply another name for duty. When we think about education today, we picture schools, books, classrooms, and long years of structured learning. But for a medieval girl, education was almost never about letters, numbers, or libraries. Instead, it was about learning how to survive, how to serve, and how to fit into the expectations of society. Knowledge, as we imagine it in the modern world, was not meant for her. In most villages, there were no schools at all. Education was not a right or even a widespread practice. The vast majority of people, male or female, grew up illiterate. Only a small fraction of the population, clergy, nobility, and some wealthy merchants had access to books or teachers. And among those, men were the ones most often chosen to study. For women, the door to letters and learning was nearly always closed. If you were a girl born to a peasant family, your education began at home. From the earliest years, you learned by watching your mother, your aunts, and your older sisters. You memorized how to grind grain, how to stir pottage, how to care for younger siblings. Instruction was oral, practical, and immediate. There were no chalkboards, no slates, no writing implements. Your classroom was the smoky corner of a cottage, your teachers the women of your household. What you learned was survival, not scholarship. The church played a major role in shaping education across medieval Europe, but its focus was on training boys for religious roles. Monasteries and cathedral schools existed, but they admitted male students almost exclusively. Girls were rarely allowed inside those walls unless they entered convents later in life. And even then, the literacy they gained was unusual, almost exceptional. The standard belief was simple: men needed learning to govern, preach, or lead. Women needed obedience, piety, and skill in domestic crafts. For noble girls, the situation was a little different. If you were born into a wealthy family, you might receive some form of structured instruction. A private tutor could be hired to teach you basic reading, often so that you could follow prayers and read the Bible in Latin. But writing was not always included. Many noble women could read but not write, because writing required more practice, materials, and training that society considered unnecessary for women. Books were expensive, handwritten on parchment by scribes. So even when a noble daughter learned to read, her access to texts was limited. Religious works and moral teachings were prioritized, while broader subjects like philosophy, law, or natural science were reserved for men. Girls of merchant families in towns had slightly better chances at literacy. In bustling cities like Florence, Paris, or London, the growing middle class valued practical skills. Some fathers taught their daughters to keep basic household accounts or to read enough to manage correspondence. But even here, it was not the norm. A girl's education remained tied to her future role as wife and mother. Learning enough to help her husband's trade might be encouraged, but ambition beyond that was frowned upon. Convents offered one of the few paths for women to gain genuine education. If a girl's family dedicated her to the church, she might live in a convent and receive instruction in reading, writing, and sometimes even Latin. Some convents maintained libraries and encouraged the copying of manuscripts. Nuns like Hildegard of Bingen, centuries later, became renowned for their knowledge, writings, and even music. But these were rare exceptions. Most girls did not have the opportunity to become nuns, and most convents focused more on piety and discipline than on intellectual growth. Still, compared to life in a village, a convent offered more educational opportunity than almost anywhere else for women. Outside of formal education, oral tradition was the main source of knowledge. Girls memorized stories, songs, and prayers passed down by family members. They might learn folk tales around the hearth or hear sermons in church that shaped their understanding of morality and the world. Knowledge of herbs, healing practices, or midwifery was also passed orally from older women to younger ones. This kind of learning, though practical and often valuable, was not recognized as education by the society of the time. Men dismissed it as superstition, even though it was often the only form of medicine available. The inequality in access to education had long-lasting effects. A girl who could not read was dependent on men for information, contracts, and legal documents. She could not write letters to defend her rights, manage property independently, or even fully understand the religious texts that guided her daily life. The church's teachings were filtered to her through priests and preachers, without her having the ability to verify or question the words herself. This dependency reinforced the broader system that kept women submissive and excluded from power. Consider also how this lack of literacy shaped women's voices in history. Most of what we know about medieval Europe comes from written records. And because women were rarely taught to write, their voices are nearly absent. We hear from monks, priests, kings, and scholars, but rarely from the women who lived, worked, and suffered alongside them. The silence of medieval women in historical texts is not because they had nothing to say, but because they were not given the tools to record it. Even when women gained education, society often distrusted it. A woman who read too much might be seen as suspicious, unnatural, or even dangerous. There were cases where literate women were accused of witchcraft or heresy, simply because knowledge in their hands was viewed as threatening. The stereotype of the learned woman as meddling, immoral, or unfeminine persisted for centuries. Thus, education for girls was not only denied, but when obtained, could also become a liability. This reality created a cycle. Without education, women remained excluded from positions of influence. Without influence, they could not advocate for broader access to learning. The system reinforced itself, generation after generation. A daughter learned what her mother knew, and rarely more. The knowledge ceiling was set by society, and most women never even approached it. Yet, we should not imagine that medieval women were ignorant or incapable. They possessed deep practical knowledge about farming, food preparation, childbirth, and medicine that was essential for survival. Their intelligence and adaptability were clear in the way they managed households, supported families, and endured hardship. But the lack of access to formal education ensured that their knowledge remained confined to the domestic sphere. It was not recognized, celebrated, or preserved in written form. When we look at childhood for medieval girls through this lens, we see that their education was designed to limit them. They were trained for obedience, not curiosity. They were taught skills that tied them to the home, not skills that might free them to explore. The message was clear from the start: your role is service, your place is inside the walls of the household, your duty is to prepare for marriage and motherhood. Learning beyond that was unnecessary, even dangerous. So imagine again the life of a young girl in this world. She sits by the hearth, turning a spindle in her small hands. Her mother speaks to her about keeping the fire going, about cooking pottage without letting it burn. Outside, she hears her brothers running, perhaps playing at mock battles with sticks. They might later learn letters from a priest or clerk. She will not. Her lessons are in silence, in service, and in repetition. The boundaries of her education are as firm as the walls of her home. As you drift into the slower rhythms of this story, remember that the lack of education was not a passive accident of history. It was intentional. It was a system designed to preserve power in male hands and to ensure that women remain dependent. The few who broke through that system are remembered as exceptions precisely because they were so rare. For the overwhelming majority, education meant nothing more than learning how to work, how to obey, and how to endure. By the time a medieval girl reached her early teens, she was no longer considered a child. Her society, her family, and even the church saw her as someone who needed to be married. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not primarily about love or romance. It was about duty, property, and survival. For women, it was less of a choice and more of a transaction, a binding agreement that shaped the entire course of their lives. From the very beginning, families arranged marriages not around affection but around alliances. If you were a peasant girl, your parents looked for a match that would secure a partner to help with farm work, provide stability, and maybe bring in a small dowry. If you were a noble woman, your parents viewed you as a piece in the larger puzzle of land, inheritance, and politics. A daughter's marriage could secure peace between rival families, bring wealth into the household, or expand influence. In both cases, a woman was less a free individual and more a means of exchange. Age played a significant role in this system, and for women, it worked against them. Girls often married shockingly young by modern standards. In some parts of Europe, betrothals could occur as early as 7, though the marriage itself was sometimes delayed until puberty. By the age of 12 or 14, many girls were considered marriageable. This meant that while still barely out of childhood, a girl could suddenly find herself pledged to a husband, often much older than she was. Men, in contrast, typically married later, often in their 20s or 30s, once they had established themselves. This age gap reinforced unequal power in the household, making young brides dependent and vulnerable. The dowry system added another layer to the transactional nature of marriage. A dowry was property, money, or goods given by a bride's family to her husband. For poor families, gathering a dowry could be a crippling financial strain. Sometimes livestock, household goods, or even clothing served as dowry. For noble families, dowries could be vast sums of money, large tracts of land, or entire castles. The dowry essentially functioned as a way to secure the marriage and to prove that the bride's family could contribute to her new household. But in practice, it reduced a woman's role to that of a costly investment or bargaining chip. Without a dowry, many girls struggled to find husbands at all. Consent, as we think of it today, was limited. The church officially taught that both bride and groom should agree to marriage, but in reality, family pressure often left women with no choice. A girl's opinion mattered little compared to the decisions of her father or guardians. Saying no to a match could bring shame or hardship to the family. In noble circles, refusing a politically advantageous marriage was almost unthinkable. Even when consent was given, it was often shaped by expectation, fear, or duty rather than genuine choice. Weddings themselves varied depending on wealth and status, but they were always public, binding events. Among peasants, a wedding might take place outside the church doors, with a priest blessing the union and the couple exchanging vows before witnesses. There might be a simple feast afterward, with food, drink, and music if the family could afford it. For nobles, weddings were elaborate affairs, sometimes lasting days, filled with banquets, tournaments, and displays of wealth. But whether simple or extravagant, the meaning was the same: the woman was now bound to her husband for life. Once married, a woman's life shifted dramatically. Her identity and legal status were tied to her husband's. She moved into his household, often leaving behind her own family and community. She was expected to obey, to bear children, and to manage domestic duties. For noble women, the pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was immense. For peasant women, the expectation was to contribute to farm work while raising children and maintaining the home. Marriage was not freedom, but a new set of obligations. The power imbalance was built into the institution itself. Husbands held legal authority over their wives. They could make decisions about property, finances, and household management without consulting them. A wife who challenged her husband risked social condemnation or even legal repercussions. Domestic violence was often overlooked or tolerated by law and custom. The church preached that men should treat their wives kindly, but it also reinforced the idea of male authority and female submission. This left women with little protection when marriages turned harsh or abusive. For noble women, marriages could be even more restrictive, despite the wealth that surrounded them. A noble woman was often used to cement alliances between powerful families. Her life was marked by long separations if her husband was away at war, the constant fear of political intrigue, and the high stakes of producing heirs. If she failed to bear children, she risked being set aside, abandoned, or replaced. In some cases, noble women gained influence by acting as regents or estate managers in their husband's absence, but such authority was always temporary and conditional. Peasant women had different challenges. Their marriages were less about politics and more about survival. They worked alongside their husbands in the fields, shared the burden of harvests, and endured the cycles of hunger and hardship together. But even here, the woman's role was clearly defined as secondary. Her labor was essential, yet undervalued. Her opinions carried little weight in village councils or communal decisions. Marriage tied her to a life of work, obedience, and limited independence. Widowhood provided one of the few paths to greater autonomy. A widow, particularly one who inherited property or wealth, could sometimes act more independently than a married woman. She might run her late husband's estate, manage business affairs, or even remarry on her own terms. But widowhood also carried risks. Without protection, widows were vulnerable to exploitation, pressure to remarry, or accusations of immorality. For many, widowhood was as precarious as marriage itself. The cultural expectations surrounding marriage were reinforced by religion. The church described marriage as a sacred union, a sacrament instituted by God. Sermons and teachings emphasized the wife's duty to obey her husband, comparing the husband to Christ and the wife to the church. Failure to submit was seen as not just disobedience but sin. In this way, the spiritual framework of the Middle Ages enshrined the transactional, unequal nature of marriage. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to imagine romance and affection being absent altogether. But we should not ignore that genuine love sometimes developed within these marriages. There were cases of couples who cared deeply for each other, who shared their burdens, and who built partnerships of mutual respect. Still, the system itself was not built for love. It was built for transaction. Love was a fortunate accident, not the expectation. For a medieval woman, then, marriage marked not the beginning of independence but the end of what little autonomy she had. She left her father's household only to enter her husband's. Her body, her labor, and her future became tied to someone else's decisions. If she was lucky, her husband treated her kindly. If not, there was little she could do. Her life was shaped by a contract made above her head, one that valued property and alliances more than her personal happiness. So as you let your thoughts drift in this quiet history tonight, picture a young girl, barely 14, dressed in her wedding gown of simple wool. Her hands tremble as she recites vows she scarcely understands. Her family stands behind her, proud of the alliance they have secured. Her husband, perhaps twice her age, grips her hand with certainty. The priest blesses the union, the witnesses murmur approval, and just like that, her future is sealed. For her, marriage is not a choice, not a dream, but a transaction, one more duty in a life already crowded with them. For a medieval woman, daily life was defined almost entirely by labor. Not labor in the sense of specialized jobs or careers, but endless tasks that stretched from sunrise to sunset and often continued long after darkness fell. There were no weekends, no holidays apart from the church calendar, and certainly no concept of rest as a reward for effort. Work was simply life, and life was work. Imagine the morning beginning in a small village home. The rooster crows, though most people are already awake. The single-room house is dim, smoky from a fire that never fully goes out. The woman stirs, rising from a straw bed that leaves bits of hay clinging to her clothes. The day's labor begins instantly, because survival depends on it. There is no time for leisure, no space for delay. One of the first duties was tending to the fire. The hearth was the heart of the home, and keeping it alive was essential. Without fire, there could be no cooking, no warmth, no light during the long winter evenings. A medieval woman might kneel, blowing carefully on the faint embers, feeding them with kindling until a flame caught. Failure meant striking flint to steel, a difficult and frustrating task, especially in damp conditions. This simple act of coaxing flame was repeated day after day, the first reminder of how much work lay ahead. Food preparation consumed enormous portions of time. Bread was a staple, but making it was a labor-intensive process. Grain had to be ground into flour, often using heavy hand querns. This grinding could take hours, and it was almost always the task of women and their daughters. Once the flour was ready, dough was kneaded, left to rise, and baked in communal ovens if available, or in makeshift hearths if not. The bread was coarse, dark, and heavy, not the soft loaves we imagine today. Alongside bread, pottage simmered endlessly in cauldrons. Pottage was a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever scraps of meat or herbs could be added. It was cheap, filling, and monotonous, but it sustained life. Stirring, seasoning, and stretching pottage for as many mouths as possible fell squarely on women's shoulders. Beyond cooking, there was the constant labor of cleaning and maintaining the household. Floors of beaten earth had to be swept, though they never truly looked clean. Clothing and linens were washed in rivers or tubs, scrubbed with lye soap that was harsh on the skin. Water had to be carried repeatedly, heavy buckets hauled from wells or streams. Every chore required physical strength and repetition. There were no machines, no shortcuts, only human effort. Textile work was another endless demand. Spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, sewing garments, and repairing worn clothes filled countless hours. Clothing had to be practical, sturdy, and able to withstand hard use. Women spun by hand, using spindles or wheels, often while walking or tending children. Weaving might be done on large looms in wealthier homes, but for peasants it was usually a matter of patching and mending. Every thread represented time, patience, and skill. It was tedious, but it was essential. Childcare overlapped with all these duties. A medieval woman rarely had the luxury of focusing only on her children. Babies were carried in slings while their mothers worked, rocked by foot while hands kneaded dough, or simply laid on the floor near the hearth. Toddlers wandered underfoot, and older children were pressed into service with simple tasks. Every child meant more mouths to feed, more clothes to make, more care to give. The cycle of birth and labor was unrelenting. Agricultural labor was another constant for peasant women. They worked alongside men in the fields during planting and harvest. They gathered firewood, tended animals, milked cows, and collected eggs. During harvest season, the entire community toiled together, and women's hands were as vital as men's. But the recognition was not equal. Women's field labor was often considered an extension of their household duties rather than independent contribution. Yet without it, survival was impossible. Brewing was also a common task. Ale was the drink of choice for most people, safer than often contaminated water. Women, known as alewives, brewed in small batches for their families and sometimes for sale. The process required knowledge of grains, fermentation, and timing. Mistakes could ruin the brew, wasting precious resources. This work demanded both skill and time, yet was often dismissed as women's work, unworthy of recognition. Seasonal chores shifted with the year. In spring, women planted gardens and gathered herbs. In summer, they dried foods, preserved meat, and sheared sheep. Autumn brought harvest, storing grains, and preparing for winter scarcity. Winter meant mending, spinning, and surviving the cold with limited resources. Every season had its labors, each one as demanding as the last. For noble women, the nature of labor was different but no less constant. They managed large households, overseeing servants, cooks, and stewards. They supervised the storage of food, the care of clothing, and the smooth running of estates. Though they did not perform all the physical work themselves, they bore responsibility for ensuring it was done. They were expected to be models of order, piety, and generosity, keeping accounts and making sure supplies lasted through lean months. Noble women also engaged in embroidery, an art form that was both practical and symbolic of status. Hours were spent stitching fine cloth for religious vestments, noble garments, or household decoration. Though more comfortable than peasant labor, it was still unending, repetitive, and bound by duty. The concept of leisure barely existed. Even festivals and feast days, which offered breaks from ordinary labor, required preparation. Women cooked special meals, brewed extra ale, sewed festive garments, and hosted guests. The work only changed shape, it did not stop. Rest was a rare luxury, often stolen in brief moments rather than granted in long stretches. Sickness and injury complicated the load. If a woman fell ill, her duties did not vanish. Others in the household might step in, but the absence of her labor was felt immediately. Chores piled up, meals went uncooked, clothes unmended. The household could not function without women's constant effort. This made their labor both invisible and irreplaceable. Pregnancy and childbirth only increased the burden. A pregnant woman still carried water, spun thread, and prepared food until she could no longer stand. After giving birth, recovery time was minimal. Within days, sometimes hours, she returned to her duties. The idea of rest after childbirth was rare outside of noble circles, and even there it was often short. Labor did not wait for bodies to heal. Social expectations reinforced this cycle. A woman who neglected her duties risked gossip, scorn, or punishment. Communities relied on women's work to function smoothly, and failure to meet expectations was judged harshly. The cultural message was clear: a good woman worked tirelessly, silently, and without complaint. Her value was measured not in wealth or recognition but in the visible results of her endless labor. Despite this, women created small networks of support. Neighbors helped one another during childbirth, harvests, or illness. Mothers taught daughters, who taught theirs in turn. Tasks like spinning or brewing were often communal, done in groups where women shared stories, songs, and advice. These gatherings provided brief relief from isolation, even as the work continued. They were moments of connection amid the monotony. Looking back, it is easy to underestimate the sheer scale of daily labor. We live in a world of machines, shortcuts, and conveniences. We flip a switch for light, turn a knob for heat, push a button for food. For medieval women, every small necessity of life required effort. Every loaf of bread, every clean shirt, every bucket of water carried with it the weight of hours of toil. life was lived in the rhythm of tasks, repeated endlessly, generation after generation. So as you drift deeper into this quiet history, picture a woman at the end of her day. Her hands are red and rough from scrubbing, her back aches from bending, her hair smells of smoke from the hearth. She sits briefly by the fire, children gathered around, a spindle still in her lap because work never truly ends. The room is silent except for the crackle of flame. Tomorrow will be the same, and so will the day after. For a medieval woman, daily labor was not just part of life, it was life itself. When we picture the Middle Ages, clothing often comes to mind in the form of colorful dresses, flowing gowns, and images from illuminated manuscripts or movies. But for the average medieval woman, clothing was not about elegance or comfort. It was about necessity, modesty, and restriction. Clothing was heavy, uncomfortable, and carefully policed by both custom and law. To dress as a woman in the Middle Ages was to carry not only cloth on your back, but also the weight of expectations, rules, and limitations that dictated who you were and how you were seen. Let's start with the basics. Most medieval women wore layers made of wool or linen. Wool was the dominant fabric across Europe. It was warm, durable, and available in many grades, from coarse rough-spun to fine cloth for the wealthy. Linen, made from flax, was softer and more comfortable, often used for undergarments worn against the skin. Cotton was rare, silk was extremely expensive, and both were limited to the rich. For the majority, clothing was practical, plain, and often itchy. A peasant woman's wardrobe usually consisted of a chemise or smock made of linen, worn as an underlayer. Over this, she wore a kirtle, a long dress, sometimes with laces or ties at the sides. On top of that might be an apron, essential for work, and in colder weather, a woolen overdress or cloak. Shoes were made of leather but were simple and often uncomfortable, with thin soles that wore out quickly. Stockings, if available, were made of wool and tied with garters. Every garment was hand-sewn, often patched and repaired until the fabric nearly fell apart. There was no thought of fashion in the modern sense, clothing was about covering the body and keeping warm. For noble women, the layers were more elaborate. They too wore chemises and kirtles, but their outer garments might include gowns with long trailing sleeves, lined cloaks, and richly dyed fabrics. Colors such as deep reds, purples, or blue signaled wealth, because the dyes were expensive and difficult to produce. Silks imported from the East were prized, but only the very rich could afford them. Embroidery decorated hems and sleeves, often done by the women themselves as a display of skill and refinement. Jewels, fur trims, and belts of metal or leather completed the picture of status. But even for noble women, the clothing was heavy, restrictive, and designed less for comfort than for showing the power of their family. Modesty was enforced at all levels of society. The church preached constantly about the dangers of women's bodies leading men into temptation. Women were told to cover their hair, their arms, their legs, and to avoid anything that might be seen as provocative. Peasant women wore simple veils or headscarves. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely, while unmarried girls might leave theirs partially visible. In noble circles, elaborate headdresses, wimples, and veils became symbols of both modesty and wealth. But whether plain or ornate, the underlying message was the same: a woman's body had to be hidden and controlled. Sumptuary laws added another layer of restriction. These were laws passed by governments or rulers that dictated what people could wear based on their social class. A peasant woman could not wear certain colors or fabrics, even if she somehow managed to obtain them. For example, fur-lined garments, silk, or particular shades like scarlet were reserved for the nobility. Breaking these laws could result in fines or public shaming. The purpose was clear: clothing was a visible marker of social order, and women were especially bound by it. Their clothing broadcasted not only their wealth or poverty but also their obedience to the hierarchy of society. The weight of clothing was another burden. Layers of wool in summer heat were stifling. In winter, clothing might keep you warm, but it was still heavy, damp, and hard to move in. Washing was rare because water was scarce and fabrics were fragile when wet. Instead, clothing absorbed smoke from fires, sweat from labor, and the smells of daily life. A medieval woman's dress was not fresh and fragrant but musty, smoky, and worn down by constant use. Pregnancy and clothing were another challenge. There were no specially made maternity garments. Instead, women loosened ties on their kirtles or expanded seams as their bodies changed. After childbirth, clothing had to be adjusted back, often by hand. Everything was reused, repaired, and repurposed. A dress might pass through multiple generations, reshaped for different bodies as needed. Clothing was not disposable, it was a constant cycle of wear, mend, and wear again. The idea of comfort in clothing was nearly absent. Corsetry as we think of it came later, but even in the Middle Ages, garments were tight, restrictive, and heavy. Movement was often limited by long skirts and sleeves. For working women, this made physical labor even harder. Imagine bending to wash laundry in a river while dragging wet wool skirts into the mud. Or carrying buckets of water while sleeves dip into the dirt. Clothing was not designed to make women's tasks easier, it was designed according to custom, modesty, and social rules. In noble households, fashion brought its own discomforts. Trailing gowns could weigh several pounds, dragging along the floor and collecting filth. Headdresses grew so elaborate in the later Middle Ages that women balanced towering structures of cloth and wire on their heads. These were not only uncomfortable but also symbols of how women were expected to display wealth and status physically, even at the expense of practicality. Every detail of clothing reinforced the idea that women's role was to be seen, judged, and controlled, rather than to live freely. Clothing also reflected marital status. As mentioned, hair covering was one clear sign, but jewelry, belts, and even shoe styles indicated whether a woman was single, married, or widowed. Widows might wear black or plain colors, while married women displayed their husband's wealth through finer fabrics. A woman's body was not her own, it was a canvas used to communicate her family's position in society. Peasant women, despite the simplicity of their clothing, were also subject to restrictions. Communities enforced modesty through gossip, criticism, and sometimes punishment. A woman who wore clothing deemed too fine could be accused of pride or vanity. One who dressed like a man by wearing shorter tunics or hose could be fined or shamed. Cross-dressing was sometimes linked with immorality or even heresy. The message was always clear: stay in your place, wear what is expected, and do not challenge the social order. Even within the home, clothing was never entirely private. Laundry was often done communally at rivers or wells. Other women could see what garments you owned, what state they were in, and what that revealed about your household. Clothing was both a necessity and a public statement, subject to the eyes of neighbors, priests, and rulers alike. The psychological effect of these restrictions is easy to imagine. From childhood, girls learned that how they dressed mattered as much as, if not more than, what they did. A girl's body had to be covered, her clothing had to follow rules, her appearance had to signal obedience. She grew up internalizing that her physical self was always under scrutiny, always judged against standards she had no control over. This constant monitoring of appearance was another invisible chain, binding women as tightly as their layered wool dresses. Even the act of making clothing was labor in itself. Women spun thread, wove fabric, dyed cloth, and stitched garments by hand. Every piece of clothing represented hours or even days of labor. The act of creating and maintaining clothing consumed vast amounts of time. And yet, once made, these garments became symbols not of women's skill and work, but of male authority and family status. So when we look back at medieval clothing, we should not imagine only pageantry and color. We should see the weight of wool in summer, the smoke-soaked cloaks in winter, the endless mending, and the strict rules that governed every hem and veil. We should see how clothing became another form of restriction, another reminder that a woman's body was never her own to present freely. As you settle deeper into this quiet story tonight, picture a woman kneeling by a hearth, patching the worn hem of her kirtle by dim firelight. Her fingers are rough from spinning, her back sore from bending, her eyes strained from long hours. The garment she repairs will keep her warm, but it will also remind her, every time she wears it, of the roles and rules that bind her. For medieval women, clothing was more than fabric. It was labor, it was restriction, and it was a constant, visible reminder of their place in the world. When we think about health today, we imagine hospitals, clinics, doctors, and medicines that can cure infections or ease pain. But for a medieval woman, health was a daily gamble, and medicine was a mixture of superstition, limited herbal knowledge, and religious ritual. Illness was common, treatment was crude, and the burden of survival fell heavily on women's bodies. To begin with, life expectancy was short. A woman who reached her mid-30s was already considered fortunate. Many died much earlier, often in childbirth or from infections that would be treatable today with simple antibiotics. The constant demands of labor, combined with poor nutrition and little rest, weakened the body. A small wound, a fever, or a tooth infection could turn deadly quickly. Health was fragile, and the odds were rarely in a woman's favor. Medical knowledge at the time was rooted in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed health depended on keeping these fluids in balance. Treatments focused on bleeding, purging, or applying leeches to restore equilibrium. For women, these practices were particularly dangerous because they were already weakened by hard work and frequent pregnancies. Losing blood through bleeding or childbirth made additional bloodletting risky, but the theory of humors was deeply entrenched. Most women never saw a doctor at all. Physicians were rare, expensive, and concentrated in cities. Peasant women relied instead on local healers, midwives, or older relatives with herbal knowledge. Remedies might include teas, poultices, or charms. Plants like rosemary, sage, and thyme were used for fevers and wounds. Willow bark, which contains a form of aspirin, was sometimes brewed to ease pain. These treatments occasionally helped, but they were inconsistent and limited by the lack of scientific understanding. Superstition played a huge role in medicine. Illness was often explained as a punishment from God, the work of demons, or the result of sin. The Church encouraged prayer, confession, and pilgrimages to holy sites as remedies. Relics of saints were believed to heal the sick, and people traveled long distances to touch or kiss them. For women, whose lives were already bound by religious expectations, illness was often framed as a test of faith or a punishment for moral weakness. Hygiene was poor, which worsened health dramatically. Bathing was rare, though not entirely absent. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, but they were often associated with immorality and later closed. Most people washed their hands and faces but avoided full immersion in water. Women, constantly exposed to smoke from fires, dirt from fields, and the grime of daily chores, lived in conditions where infection thrived. Teeth rotted, wounds festered, and parasites like lice and fleas were constant companions. The Black Death, spread by fleas on rats, reminded everyone how vulnerable they were to unseen forces of disease. Childbirth was perhaps the greatest health danger. Women gave birth multiple times throughout their lives, often starting in their teens. There was no understanding of sterilization or hygiene during delivery. Midwives helped as best they could, but complications like breech births, hemorrhages, or infections often led to death. Many women died within days of childbirth, leaving newborns to be raised by relatives or abandoned if families could not care for them. Surviving childbirth was considered an act of God's mercy, and many women prepared themselves spiritually for death each time they went into labor. Gynecological health was poorly understood. Menstruation was explained through humoral theory, often mischaracterized as a way for the female body to rid itself of excess blood. Women were sometimes shamed or excluded from activities during menstruation, believed to be impure or dangerous. There were no sanitary products as we know them today. Cloths were used and washed, but this added another burden to women's endless cycle of labor. Any irregularities in menstruation were viewed suspiciously, sometimes linked to witchcraft or moral failing rather than health conditions. Nutrition also played a critical role in women's health. Most diets were heavy in bread, pottage, and small amounts of vegetables. Meat was scarce for peasants and often reserved for festivals or wealthier households. Milk and cheese provided some protein, but malnutrition was widespread. Pregnant and nursing women needed more food but rarely received it. As a result, their bodies were weakened, and children often suffered from stunted growth or illness. Anemia, fatigue, and other diet-related conditions were common, though they were not recognized by name. Mental health was barely acknowledged, except through the lens of religion. A woman who showed signs of depression, anxiety, or trauma might be told she was possessed or sinful. Others were dismissed as hysterical or irrational. Women who acted strangely or differently risked suspicion of witchcraft. There was no language to describe postpartum depression or the toll of grief after repeated losses of children. Instead, women endured silently, carrying psychological burdens with little understanding or support. For noble women, access to better food and occasional physicians did not guarantee good health. They faced their own risks, pressure to bear heirs, elaborate but heavy clothing that restricted movement, and exposure to the same diseases that struck peasants. Even queens and duchesses died in childbirth. Doctors might prescribe exotic remedies, like ground pearls or gold, but these were more symbolic than effective. The wealthy could sometimes afford recovery periods or retreats to the countryside, but illness and death still stalked their lives relentlessly. Herbal knowledge remained one of the most important resources women had. Midwives and wise women collected plants, roots, and flowers, passing knowledge from generation to generation. Calendula for wounds, mint for stomach troubles, lavender for relaxation, these simple remedies provided some relief. Yet, their knowledge was undervalued or even feared. When treatments failed or when women gained reputations for unusual skill, accusations of witchcraft could follow. Healing, a task often left to women, was treated with suspicion rather than respect. Communal support offered some comfort during illness. Neighbors and relatives might gather to help care for the sick, cook food, or tend children. But with so little effective medicine, recovery was uncertain. Many illnesses simply ran their course, ending in either survival or death. Plagues and epidemics spread rapidly through villages and towns, leaving devastation in their wake. Women, already weakened by labor and childbearing, often succumbed in greater numbers. The absence of reliable health care shaped every aspect of a medieval woman's life. She lived with constant awareness that sickness or injury could strike at any moment, with little to protect her. Every pregnancy was shadowed by fear. Every fever carried the possibility of death. Even small ailments could spiral into tragedy. The fragility of health was inescapable, and women bore the heaviest share of its consequences. And yet, despite the risks, women persevered. They raised children, worked tirelessly, and relied on whatever remedies they had. They prayed, trusted in herbs, and supported one another. Their resilience, though often invisible in history, was remarkable. But resilience did not erase the suffering. For every woman who survived illness or childbirth, another did not. The cycle of loss was woven into the fabric of medieval life. So as you imagine yourself resting tonight, picture the dim interior of a medieval home. A woman sits near the hearth, grinding herbs in a small mortar, hoping to ease a fever in her child. Her face is lined with fatigue, her hands rough from labor, her mind burdened with worry. There are no doctors to call, no medicine to guarantee healing. Only prayer, plants, and hope. For medieval women, health and medicine were not allies, they were uncertain gambles in a world that gave them little chance. If there was one experience that defined the lives of medieval women more than any other, it was childbirth. It was both expected and feared, celebrated and dreaded, considered natural yet deadly. For medieval women, childbirth was not only a duty but also the greatest health risk they would face in their lives. From adolescence onward, girls were prepared for the reality that their bodies would be called upon to bring new life into the world. Marriage itself was structured around this expectation. The role of a wife was not just to keep a household but to produce children, especially sons. For peasants, children meant more hands to work the land. For nobles, children meant heirs to secure inheritance and political alliances. But every pregnancy came with the knowledge that survival was uncertain. To understand the dangers of childbirth in the Middle Ages, we must remember how little was known about medicine. There was no concept of germs, no antibiotics, no understanding of how to prevent infection. Childbirth took place at home, usually in the dim light of a cottage or chamber, without sterilized tools, trained doctors, or pain relief. Midwives, experienced women of the community, assisted with deliveries, but their knowledge was based on tradition, herbs, and prayer rather than science. Sometimes their wisdom saved lives. Other times, the complications were beyond anyone's ability to manage. Complications were common. Breech births, where the baby was positioned feet first, were extremely dangerous. Prolonged labor could exhaust a woman until she no longer had the strength to push. Obstructed labor, caused by a baby too large for the mother's pelvis, often ended in death for both mother and child. There were no surgical interventions like caesarean sections, at least not ones meant to save both lives. On rare occasions, a caesarean might be attempted, but it was usually performed only after the mother had died or was dying, to try to save the child. The survival of both was almost unheard of. Hemorrhage, or severe bleeding, was another constant threat. Without knowledge of how to stop internal bleeding, women who lost too much blood during labor often died within hours. Even if they survived childbirth, infections in the days afterward, what was later known as puerperal fever, were extremely common. The practice of washing hands between patients was centuries away. Midwives or helpers might move from one birth to another without cleaning tools or clothing, spreading infection unknowingly. The result was devastating. Pain was inevitable, and there was no effective relief. Herbal remedies like poppy or mandrake might dull the edge, but they carried risks and were not always available. More often, women endured hours or even days of excruciating labor without respite. The Church sometimes framed this suffering as a consequence of Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, teaching that pain in childbirth was a woman's God-given punishment. This belief reinforced the idea that women should endure silently, with prayer, rather than seek escape from the agony. For noble women, the dangers were just as real. Queens and duchesses died in childbirth at alarming rates. Records from royal households are filled with stories of noble women who did not survive labor or who lost multiple children in infancy. The wealth and comfort of noble life did not protect women from the harsh realities of biology in a world without modern medicine. Their pregnancies carried political weight, but their bodies bore the same risks as peasants. A queen's failure to produce heirs could destabilize kingdoms, but even success often cost her health or life. The frequency of childbirth compounded the danger. Women were expected to bear many children, one after another, often with little time for recovery between pregnancies. Without effective methods of birth control, most women conceived repeatedly until their bodies were worn down. Miscarriages and stillbirths were common, but they did not lessen the expectation of more pregnancies. Every new life carried the shadow of potential death. The emotional toll was immense. Women lived with the constant fear of dying in labor. Every pregnancy was a gamble, every delivery a confrontation with mortality. Families often prepared for the possibility of death by arranging for spiritual care. Priests were called to bless women in labor, to hear confessions, or to administer the last rites if the outcome looked grim. In many households, women prepared their wills while pregnant, knowing there was a real chance they would not live to raise their child. Infant survival was equally uncertain. Even when mothers endured the dangers of childbirth, many babies did not live long afterward. Premature births, congenital conditions, or infections claimed countless newborns. For a medieval woman, grief was a frequent companion. She might bury one child and soon be pregnant with another, carrying hope and sorrow in equal measure. The cycle repeated itself endlessly. The cultural framing of childbirth added another burden. It was not simply a biological process, it was moral and spiritual. The Church taught that motherhood was a woman's sacred duty, her purpose given by God. Failure to bear children, whether through infertility or repeated miscarriages, was often blamed on the woman herself. She might be viewed as cursed, sinful, or even bewitched. This stigma added shame to suffering, leaving women isolated in their grief. Midwives carried both trust and suspicion in this environment. They were essential, often the only source of aid in childbirth, but they were also vulnerable to accusations. If a birth went badly, neighbors might whisper that the midwife had used witchcraft, or that her remedies were unnatural. Many midwives lived under constant scrutiny, balancing their role as healers with the risk of being blamed when nature took its inevitable toll. Still, their presence was vital, and women often relied on their experience more than on priests or physicians. The rituals surrounding childbirth reflected both fear and hope. Women in labor might hold religious charms, recite prayers, or keep relics nearby. Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, was often invoked. Churches offered special blessings for expectant mothers, though these did not lessen the risks. Afterward, if mother and child survived, thanksgiving prayers were given. But survival was never guaranteed, and many families grieved as often as they celebrated. The cycle of danger did not end with the birth itself. Postpartum recovery was fragile, and complications could appear suddenly. A woman might seem to improve, only to develop fever and infection days later. Others were left weakened, never regaining full strength after multiple pregnancies. This chronic exhaustion limited their ability to work, yet the household still depended on them. The expectation to resume labor quickly after childbirth was relentless. For noble women, confinement was common. They often gave birth in special chambers, away from men, surrounded by female attendants. The room might be darkened, with tapestries covering windows and fires burning to create warmth. This practice, intended as protection, sometimes made conditions worse, trapping heat, smoke, and infection inside. What seemed like comfort could become suffocating, another reminder of how little was understood about health. The scale of loss shaped entire communities. It was rare to find a family untouched by death in childbirth. Stories of mothers buried with their newborns were tragically common. Every village carried memories of women lost in labor, and every surviving mother knew she might be next. This shared experience reinforced a culture of endurance, where suffering was normalized and rarely questioned. Yet, amid all this danger, women persisted. They gave birth in fields, in cottages, in castles, often with little more than the support of other women. They endured the pain, faced the risks, and carried on. Their resilience was extraordinary, though it was rarely celebrated. Instead, their suffering was treated as inevitable, their survival as ordinary rather than remarkable. So, as you let your thoughts drift tonight, imagine the quiet room of a medieval home. A woman lies in labor, surrounded by midwives, the air filled with prayer and tension. Her face is pale with pain, her hands clutching the sheets, her body fighting for life. The outcome is uncertain, as it always was. For medieval women, childbirth was not just the beginning of life, it was the constant confrontation with death. In medieval Europe, the legal status of women was one of near-total dependence, a system that treated them as extensions of the men in their lives rather than as independent individuals. From the moment a girl was born, she was tied legally to her father's household, and when she married, that legal identity transferred to her husband. A woman could rarely act on her own in matters of property, contracts, or court appearances. The law recognized her presence, but not her independence. To be a medieval woman was to live under a legal structure designed to control, limit, and define her rights almost entirely through male authority. The principle that governed much of this was the idea of coverture, which meant that a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. Under this system, she could not make contracts, sue or be sued, or own property separately from her husband. Any wages she earned, any inheritance she might receive, or any land she brought into the marriage automatically became her husband's to control. Widows sometimes regained a degree of independence after their husband's death, but while married, a woman was legally invisible. This principle applied across much of Europe, though the exact details varied by region and period. The pattern remained consistent: men acted as the legal representatives of women, regardless of the woman's own ability, intelligence, or wealth. For unmarried women, the situation was not much freer. Young women remained under the legal authority of their fathers or guardians. They could not marry without permission, and their dowries or inheritances were often arranged and controlled by male relatives. In towns and cities, women might sometimes appear in court records conducting business, especially widows or women without immediate male relatives, but these cases were exceptions rather than the norm. In most places, an unmarried woman had no true independence, because the assumption was that she would soon marry and transfer her identity to her husband. The court system itself reflected these limitations. Women could sometimes give testimony in cases, but their words carried less weight than those of men. In some legal traditions, the testimony of 2 women was required to equal the testimony of 1 man. Women were often excluded entirely from serving as witnesses in cases involving property, politics, or high crimes. Their voices were permitted in matters of childbirth, neighborhood disputes, or domestic affairs, areas that society saw as belonging to women, but not in the larger framework of law and governance. This created a world where women were legally acknowledged only in narrow, restricted ways, reinforcing their exclusion from broader power. Marriage contracts and dowries also reinforced women's lack of legal control. A dowry was intended to provide a measure of security for a bride, but in practice, it was controlled by her husband once given. If he squandered it or mismanaged it, she had little recourse. Divorce, in the modern sense, was virtually impossible. The church allowed separation in cases of abuse or desertion, but remarriage was prohibited as long as both partners lived. This meant that women trapped in unhappy or violent marriages had almost no legal way out. Their lives remained tied to men who might mistreat or neglect them, and the law provided little protection. Widowhood, paradoxically, offered the greatest chance for women to experience legal independence. A widow could sometimes inherit her husband's property, manage estates, and act in court as the head of her household. Some widows became influential figures in their communities, running businesses or lending money. In towns, widows were often allowed to continue their husband's trade or guild membership, because their skills and economic activity were necessary for the community. However, this independence was fragile. Widows were frequently pressured to remarry, both to secure alliances and to return their property to male control. A wealthy widow might attract suitors less out of affection than out of desire to control her assets. Even as she gained temporary authority, her freedom remained conditional and precarious. Among noble families, women's legal status was intertwined with property and inheritance. Daughters could inherit land in some regions, especially in the absence of sons, but their inheritance usually passed into the control of their husbands once they married. Women were used as conduits for transferring wealth and power between families. Inheritance disputes often revealed how little autonomy women truly had. They might be central to the question of who owned land or titles, but they rarely had the ability to decide their own fates within those disputes. Their bodies, their marriages, and their property became tools of negotiation in a system designed by and for men. The church reinforced this legal structure by framing women as subordinate. Religious law and secular law were often intertwined, and canon law declared that wives should obey their husbands just as the church obeyed Christ. Sermons and religious texts stressed obedience, modesty, and silence as female virtues. A woman who challenged her husband's authority or asserted her independence risked not only legal repercussions but also moral condemnation. Disobedience could be painted as sin, and sin carried consequences both in life and in the afterlife. This religious framing gave legal restrictions additional weight, embedding them into the very moral fabric of society. Women accused of crimes faced their own challenges. Punishments varied by region, but women often faced harsher consequences for offenses tied to morality, such as adultery or sex outside of marriage. Men might escape with fines or light penalties, while women could be shamed, beaten, or ostracized. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy disproportionately targeted women, combining legal judgment with social prejudice. Trials were often stacked against them, with little chance to defend themselves effectively. In this way, the law not only restricted women's rights but also amplified their vulnerability to accusations and punishment. Guilds and urban economies presented a slightly different picture. In some medieval cities, women could participate in trades, especially in textiles, brewing, and midwifery. Guild records sometimes list women as members or as independent workers. Yet even here, the law placed limits. Married women were usually listed under their husband's name, and widows who carried on trades did so only with permission. While women's labor was necessary and visible, their legal recognition was narrow and conditional. They contributed significantly to urban economies, but the law rarely acknowledged them as full participants. The absence of legal status also meant the absence of protection. Domestic violence, for example, was largely ignored by law. A husband beating his wife was considered a private matter unless it led to death. Women had no clear legal path to escape abuse or neglect. Their safety depended on the goodwill of their husbands, families, or communities, rather than on legal protections. This lack of recourse reinforced women's dependence and vulnerability, making them legally and socially trapped. One of the most striking features of medieval law is how it reflected and reinforced women's silence in history. Legal documents, charters, contracts, wills, were written by men, for men. Women appeared in them primarily as daughters, wives, or widows, rarely as independent actors. Their names surface in the margins, connected to property or inheritance, but their voices are almost always absent. The very structure of the law erased women from the official record, leaving us today with fragments rather than full accounts of their lives. Despite these restrictions, some women did navigate the legal system effectively. Wealthy widows managed estates, noble women acted as regents for young sons, and urban women ran businesses. Their success, however, was the exception rather than the rule. They operated within a framework designed to limit them, finding small spaces of opportunity in the cracks of the system. But the existence of exceptions does not change the reality that for most women, the law was a barrier, not a tool. The medieval legal system was not static, and it varied across regions. In some places, especially in parts of Spain or Italy, women had slightly more property rights than in Northern Europe. Inheritance laws sometimes allowed daughters greater claims, and urban charters occasionally recognized women's contributions to trade. But these differences were small compared to the overall pattern of male dominance. The consistency across Europe was the presumption that women were legally dependent, morally subordinate, and socially controlled. To live as a woman in medieval Europe was to live with the constant knowledge that your legal identity was never fully your own. Your father spoke for you, your husband spoke for you, your widowhood gave you brief independence that might be taken away with remarriage. Your testimony carried less weight, your property was not yours to keep, your body and labor were tied to systems of law and religion that left little room for choice. Even in towns and courts, where women's contributions were visible, the legal framework denied them recognition. It was a world where law did not protect women but constrained them, shaping every aspect of their existence. Religion shaped almost every aspect of life in medieval Europe, and for women, it defined not only how they were expected to live but also how they were judged. The Church was the most powerful institution of the age, and its teachings, sermons, and doctrines created a moral framework that left little room for women to define themselves outside of submission, obedience, and service. To be a medieval woman was to live under a system that constantly reminded you of your inferiority, both in law and in the eyes of God, as interpreted by men. The foundation of this worldview was the story of Adam and Eve. The biblical narrative, repeated endlessly in sermons and texts, taught that Eve had been created from Adam's rib, marking her as secondary and derivative. More importantly, Eve's choice to eat the forbidden fruit was described as the origin of sin, a moral failing that stained all of humanity. Women were therefore viewed as the daughters of Eve, naturally inclined toward temptation and weakness. This single story became one of the most powerful justifications for treating women as morally suspect and in need of constant control. Every priest, every sermon, and every text reinforced the idea that women bore responsibility for the fall of humanity, and that their lives had to be lived in humility and obedience as a way of counteracting that ancient fault. The Church also taught that women had two paths in life: marriage or religious devotion. Marriage was the default, with women expected to obey husbands, bear children, and live chastely within the marital bed. Religious devotion meant entering a convent, where obedience to abbesses, priests, and the broader hierarchy of the Church replaced obedience to husbands. In either case, a woman's life was one of submission. Even the supposed path of spiritual independence within a convent was carefully monitored and controlled by male authorities, with bishops and priests overseeing the rules of female monastic life. Virginity was valued to an extreme degree, and the Church framed it as the highest state for women. Saints like the Virgin Mary were exalted as models of purity, humility, and obedience. Virginity represented not only physical chastity but also moral perfection, a way for women to be honored spiritually while remaining firmly outside the realms of power and authority. Yet, the same system also condemned women who remained unmarried, framing them as suspicious, odd, or unfit if they did not dedicate themselves to the convent. This contradiction meant that most women could never fully align with the moral ideals set for them. If they married, they were viewed as spiritually lesser than virgins; if they stayed single outside a convent, they were viewed as suspect, and if they became nuns, they were still limited by the restrictions of the Church hierarchy. The regulation of sexuality was a central theme in morality. Women were constantly warned against lust, immodesty, and temptation, while men were framed as vulnerable to being led astray by women's supposed weakness. Sermons instructed women to cover their bodies, lower their voices, and avoid laughter or behavior that might attract male attention. The assumption was that men could not control themselves if women behaved improperly, and therefore women carried the burden of maintaining moral order. This logic excused male misbehavior while blaming women for corruption. Even clothing, as discussed earlier, was policed in moral terms, with laws and sermons condemning women who wore garments considered too revealing, too fine, or too similar to men's clothing. A woman's morality was judged not only by her actions but also by how she appeared in public. Confession reinforced these ideas. Women were expected to confess their sins to priests, often in humiliating detail. Priests, all male, acted as arbiters of morality, questioning women about sexual thoughts, marital duties, or any failures in modesty. This system gave men direct power over women's consciences, shaping how they understood themselves and their worth. A woman who failed to confess properly, or who was accused of hiding sins, could face spiritual condemnation and social shame. The act of confession became another form of control, keeping women constantly aware of their supposed failings. The Church also emphasized suffering as a natural part of womanhood. Pain in childbirth, as mentioned before, was framed as divine punishment for Eve's sin. Enduring this suffering patiently was considered virtuous, a sign of submission to God's will. Women who cried out in labor were sometimes scolded for lacking faith or humility. Widows were praised if they accepted grief. They were warned against vanity, gossip, or laughter. By the time they reached adulthood, these lessons were ingrained, shaping how women viewed themselves and how they were viewed by others. A woman who tried to assert independence or question authority was labeled prideful, a moral failing that the Church condemned repeatedly. Humility was not just a virtue but a survival strategy in a system designed to silence women. Even death reflected these moral frameworks. Women were often buried with symbols of their roles, married women with reminders of domestic duty, nuns with reminders of devotion. Funerals emphasized their obedience, their chastity, or their suffering as marks of their faithfulness. Their individuality was erased, replaced with moral categories that defined them more by conformity than by who they were. Religion and morality, then, worked together to create an invisible cage around medieval women. Every aspect of life, clothing, speech, labor, childbirth, marriage, was infused with moral expectations set by the church and enforced by men. Women were told they were weak, sinful, and dependent, and these messages were repeated so often that they became the air women breathed. Even those who resisted or found ways to assert themselves had to do so within a framework that condemned independence as dangerous. The system was total, shaping not just law and culture but the very sense of self that women carried. For medieval women, religion was both comfort and control. It offered the promise of salvation, the hope of divine mercy, and the solace of ritual and community. At the same time, it reinforced their subordination, justified their suffering, and limited their freedom. It was a structure they could not escape, and it defined them. By the 13th and 14th centuries, formal church teachings began to connect female midwives and healers with accusations of interfering in God's will. The fear was not just that they might heal but that they might also harm, bringing illness or death through magical means. For ordinary women, this meant that roles essential to community survival became fraught with suspicion. Midwives, for example, held crucial responsibilities in childbirth, a time of enormous danger. They used herbs, prayers, and practical techniques to ease labor, cut umbilical cords, and care for newborns. Yet if a child died in delivery or a mother failed to survive, the midwife might be accused of witchcraft. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, were also at risk. Brewing was a female-dominated trade in many villages, and accusations of adding strange ingredients or causing drunkenness through magical means were common. Even widows who lived alone might attract suspicion, especially if they survived better than their neighbors during times of scarcity. Communities were quick to look for scapegoats when misfortune struck. A bad harvest, a sudden storm, or an outbreak of disease demanded explanation in a world where science was not understood. The devil, demons, and witches provided a ready answer. If a cow stopped giving milk, it was easier to blame a jealous neighbor's curse than to admit to poor grazing conditions. If a child fell ill, people looked for signs of malice rather than bacteria. And because women already carried the burden of suspicion as morally weaker, they became the targets of these accusations. A woman who was outspoken, odd, or simply disliked could quickly find herself whispered about as a witch. The law and the church began to codify these suspicions. As early as the 13th century, ecclesiastical courts investigated accusations of sorcery and heresy. Women might be questioned, forced to confess, or punished with penance. While executions for witchcraft were rarer in the early medieval period than later, punishments could still be severe: fines, whippings, imprisonment, or banishment. The fear of being labeled a witch hung over women's lives, especially those who stood out in any way from the expectations of modesty and obedience. By the late Middle Ages, treatises on witchcraft circulated that focused heavily on women as the primary culprits. The most infamous, Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, would become central to the witch hunts of the following centuries. But its arguments drew on ideas that had already circulated for centuries, that women were weaker, more carnal, and more easily corrupted by Satan. The book explicitly stated that most witches were women because of these supposed inherent weaknesses. Though it came at the very end of the medieval period, it built on the long history of suspicion and prejudice that had already shaped women's lives. The impact of witchcraft fears on daily life was profound, even if not every accusation led to punishment. Women lived with the knowledge that their behavior, their knowledge, or even their survival could be used against them. An elderly woman who muttered to herself, a midwife whose patient died, or a neighbor who quarreled over boundaries could find herself at the center of suspicion. Gossip spread quickly in small communities, and once someone was suspected, the label was hard to shake. Even women who tried to conform perfectly could be accused if others envied them or wished them harm. social tensions often lay beneath accusations. In times of famine or plague, communities turned on those who seemed different or expendable. Poor women, widows, and the elderly were frequent targets. They lacked male protectors, they might have owned little property, and they often depended on neighbors for survival. This dependence, combined with resentment, made them easy scapegoats. At the same time, more successful women, those who brewed ale profitably, managed land well as widows, or practiced effective healing, could also be accused out of envy. The fear of witches was not just about religion, it was about power, competition, and control within communities. Punishments for witchcraft varied, but the social consequences were devastating even without legal action. A woman accused of witchcraft might be ostracized, denied help, or shunned in church. Her reputation could be destroyed by a single rumor. If she was brought before authorities, she faced interrogation that often assumed her guilt from the start. Confessions were sometimes extracted under duress or threats. Even if she survived the process, the stigma followed her, and her family might also suffer from the shame. The link between witchcraft fears and women's morality reinforced the broader system of control. By framing women as naturally prone to sin and witchcraft, society justified keeping them subordinate. If women were capable of bringing harm simply by their nature, then male authority was presented as necessary for protection. The fear of witches became a cultural tool, reminding women of the dangers of stepping outside their prescribed roles. Knowledge of herbs, independence, or even simple eccentricity could be grounds for suspicion, so conformity became a means of survival. Yet not all women lived in fear. Some embraced roles as healers or wise women despite the risks, continuing to provide herbal remedies, charms, and advice. Communities often relied on them, even as they whispered against them. This tension, between reliance and suspicion, defined much of women's experience with witchcraft fears. Women were needed, but they were never fully trusted. Their knowledge was valuable, but it was always at risk of being condemned as dangerous. In towns and cities, witchcraft accusations were sometimes tied to economic and social shifts. As guilds became more male-dominated, women who had once worked in brewing, textiles, or healing found themselves pushed out. Accusing women of witchcraft could be a way of eliminating female competition. Similarly, in noble circles, accusations could be used politically to discredit rivals. The association between women and witchcraft was flexible enough to serve many purposes, from resolving local grudges to reinforcing broader gender hierarchies. By the close of the medieval period, the idea that women were inherently connected to witchcraft had become deeply ingrained. The groundwork was laid for the massive persecutions that followed in the 16th and 17th centuries. But even before that time, women lived under the shadow of suspicion, their lives shaped by the constant possibility of being labeled witches. It was not always about formal trials or executions, it was about the atmosphere of mistrust, the ever-present fear that survival and conformity were the only shields against accusation. For medieval women, witchcraft fears were another layer in the web of restrictions that defined their lives. They were already controlled by marriage, law, and morality, but the suspicion of witchcraft made independence even more dangerous. To know too much, to speak too boldly, to live too freely, these could all mark a woman as a threat. The fears of communities, the teachings of the church, and the structures of the law combined to make witchcraft not only a religious concern but also a gendered weapon. Women bore the weight of it most heavily, and the scars of that suspicion remain visible in the way history recorded them less as individuals and more as stereotypes of danger and sin. One of the most sobering aspects of women's lives in the Middle Ages was their constant exposure to violence and their almost complete lack of protection from it. Violence was woven into the structure of medieval society, wars raged across kingdoms, lords exercised power through force, punishments for crime were brutal, and everyday disputes could turn deadly. Within this environment, women were particularly vulnerable. They were legally weaker, socially dependent, and physically burdened by work and childbearing. The combination of these factors made violence not an occasional hazard but an ongoing feature of life. At the most immediate level, many women faced violence within their own households. Domestic abuse was rarely questioned or punished. A husband's authority over his wife was accepted both legally and morally. The church preached that husbands should be kind, but it also emphasized obedience and submission from wives, which meant that most instances of abuse were considered private matters. Laws in many regions allowed a man to discipline his wife physically, and only the most extreme cases of injury or death brought official intervention. Even then, the husband might face light punishment compared to what a woman would endure if she were accused of crimes like adultery or theft. For countless women, this meant that the very place meant to provide shelter was also a space of danger, with no recourse for protection. Outside the home, women were at risk from strangers and neighbors alike. Assaults against women, especially sexual violence, were common. Rape was technically condemned by both church and law, but prosecutions were rare and convictions rarer still. The burden of proof fell heavily on the woman, who had to demonstrate not only that she had been assaulted but also that she had resisted strongly enough. Failure to show visible injuries or call for help could lead to accusations that she had consented. Victims who did speak out often faced shame, disbelief, or further harm. Noble women might have slightly better chances of obtaining justice if their families were powerful, but even they were more often silenced than vindicated. For peasant women, pursuing justice was almost unthinkable, since challenging men in court was both costly and socially dangerous. War magnified these dangers. Armies moving across Europe brought devastation not only to soldiers but to civilians, and women were particularly exposed. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of villages raided, crops burned, and women assaulted. Rape during wartime was widespread, seen as a spoil of conquest rather than a crime. Women captured during wars could be enslaved, forced into concubinage, or used as bargaining chips in negotiations. In border regions or areas contested by lords, repeated raids left women in constant fear of violence, displacement, and loss. For noble women, castles might provide some protection, but sieges often ended in brutal treatment for women inside. Their status could not shield them from the cruelty of war, which often targeted women precisely because of the humiliation it inflicted on their male relatives. Beyond physical assault, women were vulnerable to public violence through punishment and shaming. Medieval justice was harsh and highly visible. Thieves might be whipped in the marketplace, adulterers paraded through the streets, and those accused of prostitution or sexual misconduct humiliated before crowds. Women were particularly targeted for punishments that emphasized shame. They might be forced to ride backwards on donkeys, wear mocking signs, or have their heads shaved. The point was not only to punish but also to reinforce gendered ideas of morality and obedience. Men could be violent without losing honor, women who transgressed were punished publicly as a warning to others. Accusations of witchcraft, as explored earlier, also carried violent consequences. Women suspected of sorcery faced interrogation, imprisonment, and physical torture in some cases. Even before the major witch hunts of later centuries, women were already vulnerable to being labeled dangerous outsiders. Violence here took both physical and social forms, exclusion, beatings, and even executions. Communities that turned against women in this way inflicted not only bodily harm but also permanent destruction of reputation and social standing. The vulnerability of women extended to economic and legal violence as well. Widows, for example, might be harassed or dispossessed by relatives or neighbors eager to claim their property. Without a male protector, women were often seen as easy targets. Some widows successfully defended their rights in court, but many more lost land and livelihood through coercion, threats, or outright theft. Similarly, poor women who relied on work like brewing, spinning, or midwifery could be pushed out by men or accused of misconduct to eliminate competition. These forms of structural violence reinforce the precariousness of women's lives, showing that vulnerability was not limited to physical harm but extended to survival itself. The fear of violence shaped women's daily behavior. They were encouraged to remain modest, silent, and obedient not only as virtues but as forms of self-protection. Speaking out too boldly, resisting too openly, or living too independently could provoke anger or suspicion. Gossip and rumor could escalate into accusations, and accusations could escalate into physical punishment. In this way, violence was not just an act committed against women but a constant possibility that structured their choices. The awareness of what could happen kept many women bound to roles of submission. Communities themselves often perpetuated this cycle. Villages and towns were tight-knit, and everyone knew each other's business. If violence occurred within a marriage, neighbors might gossip but rarely intervene. If a woman was attacked by a stranger, her reputation might be questioned rather than the attacker's behavior. Shame was placed on victims rather than perpetrators, which discouraged women from seeking help. The system worked to protect male authority at the expense of female safety, embedding vulnerability as a permanent condition of womanhood. Noble women experienced violence differently but no less intensely. They might be kidnapped for ransom, forced into marriages, or targeted during political struggles. Their wealth and connections made them valuable pawns, and violence against them could destabilize entire regions. Chronicles tell of noble women carried off by rival lords, imprisoned in castles, or pressured into marriages to secure alliances. Their lives were not their own to control, and violence remained a tool used by men to manipulate family fortunes and political power. The fact that they lived in castles did not guarantee safety, it often made them more of a target. One particularly brutal form of violence against women was linked to accusations of adultery. A wife accused of betraying her husband's honor could be punished with beatings, confinement, or even death in some regions. Men who committed adultery were far less likely to face consequences. The double standard was glaring, but it was accepted as part of the social order. Women carried the burden of preserving not only their own reputations but the reputations of their families, and any hint of impropriety could trigger harsh consequences. The culture of honor tied to male authority also endangered women. Men defended their status through violence, whether in duels, feuds, or public fights. Women caught in these disputes could be harmed as symbols of family honor. To insult a man's wife, daughter, or sister was to attack his honor, and violence often followed. Women became both pawns and victims in these conflicts, suffering injury or death as a result of quarrels they had little control over. In towns, women faced vulnerability in public spaces. Markets, taverns, and streets could be dangerous places, especially for those without male companions. Harassment, assault, and theft were common risks. Law sometimes attempted to regulate behavior, but enforcement was inconsistent. Women selling goods in markets or working in trades were exposed not only to economic pressures but also to physical threats. For poorer women, survival often meant braving these dangers daily. Despite all this, women developed strategies of resilience. They formed support networks with other women, relying on neighbors, friends, and kin for protection and solidarity. Groups of women might band together to confront abusers, defend widows, or assist those in childbirth. These informal networks provided some measure of safety, though they could not eliminate the larger structures of violence. Women also turned to the church for spiritual refuge, praying to saints for protection, though the same church often reinforced the systems that left them vulnerable. In the end, violence and vulnerability were not occasional interruptions in women's lives but defining features of them. Whether through domestic abuse, public punishment, war, or accusations, women lived with the knowledge that harm could come at any moment, with little recourse for justice. Their lives were shaped by caution, silence, and endurance in the face of systems designed to protect men and expose women. The medieval world was violent for everyone, but for women, the vulnerability was compounded by their lack of power, their restricted legal status, and the constant cultural messages that framed them as weak, sinful, and expendable. One of the most striking restrictions on women in the medieval world was the lack of freedom to move about independently. Today, we take for granted that we can walk down the street, travel between towns, or even cross borders without asking permission from a parent, spouse, or local authority. For a medieval woman, movement was not so simple. Her life was shaped by boundaries, the walls of her home, the limits of her village, the expectations of her family, and the rules of the church. These boundaries were not always physical walls, but they were real and deeply felt. They reminded women constantly that their mobility was not their own to control. For most peasant women, daily life rarely extended beyond the village. A typical village was small, perhaps a cluster of a few dozen houses, fields, and a church. Women's lives were concentrated around the home, the well, the fields, and the marketplace. Fetching water, tending animals, and working the fields took them no farther than a few miles. Travel outside of these spaces was unusual and often required a reason tied to family duty, religious observance, or economic necessity. A trip to a neighboring village for a wedding or a church festival might be an exception, but for the majority of women, most days were spent within sight of their own homes. Movement outside the village was limited by practical dangers as well. Roads were poor, bandits were common, and traveling alone was risky. A woman traveling without male company was particularly vulnerable to harassment or attack. For this reason, women usually traveled in groups or with husbands, brothers, or fathers. Social norms reinforced this arrangement. The woman seen traveling alone risked her reputation, as independence could be read as impropriety. To be respectable meant to be accompanied, and this cultural expectation reinforced the idea that women did not belong in public spaces on their own. Markets and fairs offered one of the few opportunities for women to experience a broader world. Many women went to sell surplus goods such as eggs, butter, or textiles, and some earned reputations as market traders. Larger regional fairs might attract people from miles away, and women participated as buyers and sellers. Yet even in these spaces, their movement was shaped by restrictions. Guilds, which controlled much of trade in towns, often excluded women or relegated them to minor roles. Women could sell small goods, but larger-scale economic activity was dominated by men. Furthermore, markets were noisy, crowded, and dangerous places, where theft and harassment were common. A woman's ability to participate was real, but her vulnerability remained obvious. Noble women faced different restrictions. Their lives were often confined within the walls of castles or manors. They might oversee households, receive guests, or accompany their husbands to court, but their movement was tied to political and familial expectations. Noble women rarely traveled without retinues, and their journeys were often arranged as part of political marriages, pilgrimages, or household relocations. Even queens had limited independence. Their travels were tied to the needs of their families or their kingdoms, not to personal choice. When they moved, they were often surrounded by attendants, guards, and advisors, ensuring that their presence served a political purpose rather than personal freedom. Religion played a major role in controlling women's movement. The church promoted the idea that women belonged in the domestic sphere, praising silence, modesty, and obedience. Religious texts and sermons warned against women wandering in public, gossiping in markets, or being seen in taverns. Women were expected to attend church regularly, but even there their movement was restricted. They sat separately from men, often in designated spaces. Pilgrimages, one of the most important religious journeys of the age, offered women rare chances to travel long distances, but these were usually undertaken with groups or families. A woman traveling alone on pilgrimage was viewed with suspicion unless she was a widow of advanced age or a nun. Speaking of nuns, convents offered both opportunities and restrictions for women's movement. A convent might provide safety, education, and spiritual purpose, but it also imposed physical boundaries. Nuns lived cloistered lives, rarely leaving the convent walls. This was intended to preserve purity and devotion, but it also meant that women who joined religious orders exchanged one kind of restriction for another. Instead of the household, the cloister defined their world. Even powerful abbesses, who managed lands and commanded respect, rarely traveled freely. Their authority was real but geographically confined. Legal systems also reinforced the limits on women's mobility. In many places, married women required their husband's permission to travel or conduct business outside the home. Guardianship laws meant that unmarried women remained under the control of fathers or male relatives, who determined when and where they could go. Widows had more independence, sometimes traveling to manage property or pursue legal claims, but even they were vulnerable to accusations if they appeared too bold or independent in their movements. The fear of scandal kept many women from venturing too far beyond what was expected. The fear of scandal was powerful. A woman seen frequently in public without clear purpose could attract gossip. Markets and wells were acceptable spaces, but taverns, roads, and unfamiliar towns were not. A woman's reputation could be damaged quickly if neighbors interpreted her movement as immoral. This social surveillance meant that women policed their own behavior, avoiding situations that might spark rumor. Reputation was essential to survival, especially in marriage markets, and a careless outing could harm a woman's future prospects. Even within the household, movement could be restricted by men. Some husbands controlled their wives closely, limiting their participation in community life. Others allowed greater freedom, but always within the framework of patriarchal authority. The idea that a woman's place was inside the home was repeated so often that it became naturalized, shaping how women and men alike viewed the world. A woman's movement was not her right, it was a privilege granted by the men in her life. Travel during wartime added another layer of danger. Women fleeing raids, sieges, or armies often had no choice but to move, but such journeys were perilous. Refugees faced hunger, exposure, and violence along the way. Many women were captured, assaulted, or enslaved. Noble women caught in these circumstances might be ransomed or forced into marriage, while peasant women often had no such protections. War displaced thousands, but it affected women particularly harshly, as their vulnerability made every journey more dangerous. Despite all these restrictions, women did find ways to move beyond their immediate environments. Some became traveling peddlers, carrying goods between towns. Others followed armies as camp followers, providing cooking, laundry, and other services. These roles were precarious and often disreputable, but they provided means of survival for women without support. Pilgrimage, too, offered real opportunities, with women joining large groups to journey to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. These moments of expanded movement gave women glimpses of a wider world, though they were exceptions rather than norms. Movement was also symbolic of social status. Wealthier women, though restricted in other ways, sometimes traveled more widely because they had resources and protection. A noblewoman might accompany her husband to court or to visit other estates, while a merchant's wife might travel with him to trading centers. Poor women, by contrast, often could not leave their villages at all, tied down by work, lack of resources, and vulnerability. Thus, mobility reflected not only gender but also class. Yet across the spectrum, women's freedom of movement was more limited than men's. The restriction of movement was not simply about safety or logistics, it was about control. By limiting women's access to public spaces, medieval society reinforced the idea that women belonged in the private sphere. Public life, markets, councils, guilds, courts, was for men. Private life, hearth, household, and child-rearing, was for women. These boundaries were enforced not only by laws but also by gossip, sermons, and the daily habits of communities. A woman who stepped outside these roles risked not only physical danger but also social condemnation. For medieval women, then, the world was both small and heavily watched. Their daily paths traced circles between hearth, field, market, and church, rarely straying far. Journeys beyond those circles required permission, protection, and justification. The idea of independent female movement was almost unthinkable, because mobility itself was tied to male authority. Even when women did move, on pilgrimage, in markets, in refugee flights, it was usually under conditions that reminded them of their vulnerability. The lack of freedom of movement shaped women's understanding of the world. Many lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, never seeing distant towns, let alone foreign lands. Their knowledge of geography came through stories, hearsay, or the accounts of men who traveled. The boundaries of their lives were set not by their curiosity or ability but by social structures designed to contain them. In this way, restricted movement was both a practical reality and a metaphor for their broader lack of freedom. Although the household defined much of women's existence in the medieval period, women also participated in work outside the home. This work was rarely recognized with the same seriousness as men's labor, and often it was undervalued, underpaid, or restricted by custom and law. Nevertheless, women's contributions to the economic life of villages, towns, and even noble estates were essential. Without women's labor beyond the household, the medieval economy simply could not have functioned. Yet, the opportunities they had were narrow, precarious, and often fraught with risks to reputation and security. In the countryside, peasant women were expected to help with agricultural tasks in addition to their domestic responsibilities. They worked alongside men in planting, weeding, harvesting, and threshing. During harvest season, women's labor was absolutely necessary, and entire families went into the fields together. They gleaned leftover grain after the main harvest, a back-breaking task that nonetheless provided vital food for survival. Women also tended animals, milking cows, feeding pigs, gathering eggs, and processing dairy products. These contributions were crucial, but they were seen as natural extensions of their domestic role rather than independent labor. Women might spend 12 or more hours a day combining field work with housework, yet the recognition went to their husbands or fathers as heads of households. In towns and cities, women's work took different forms. Many women participated in crafts and trades, sometimes informally and sometimes as members of guild households. A wife of a craftsman was expected to contribute to the family trade, whether in brewing, baking, textile production, or metalwork. She might not be listed as a master herself, but she performed essential tasks, trained apprentices, and kept accounts. In some guilds, widows were allowed to continue their husband's trade, inheriting his workshop and maintaining business until they remarried or passed it on to a son. These widows often demonstrated impressive business skill, but their authority was conditional and temporary, granted by male-dominated guild systems only out of necessity. Textile work was perhaps the most significant area of female employment. Women spun thread, wove cloth, and produced garments at every level of society. Spinning in particular was so central to female labor that the term distaff side came to mean the female line of a family. In rural areas, spinning was constant background work, done while watching children or tending fires. In towns, women participated in organized cloth production, carding wool, spinning yarn, or weaving on looms. Large-scale textile industries employed thousands of women, often at lower wages than men received for similar tasks. Embroidery was another important female craft, practiced by both peasant women and noble women. For the wealthy, embroidery became a mark of refinement, with noble women producing elaborate church vestments and tapestries. For poorer women, embroidery might provide small income, but it was rarely recognized as skilled labor on par with men's crafts. Brewing was another common form of women's work beyond the home. Known as alewives, many women brewed ale in small batches and sold it locally. Ale was a staple drink, safer than water and consumed daily by all classes. Women dominated brewing in many towns, but as the trade became more profitable, men increasingly pushed women out. Guilds restricted female brewers, and accusations of poor quality or immorality were often leveled against women who tried to maintain independence in the trade. By the late Middle Ages, commercial brewing had largely shifted to male control, but during earlier centuries, women's brewing was central to community life and economy. Midwifery and healing also provided opportunities for women to work beyond their own households. Midwives held vital roles, assisting in childbirth and caring for mothers and infants. Their knowledge was practical, based on experience and herbal remedies. Some midwives gained respected positions within their communities, though as noted before, they also lived under suspicion. Healing more generally, providing herbs, charms, or advice, was a common female occupation. These women filled the gaps left by a medical system that was inaccessible to most peasants. Yet, their authority was fragile, easily undermined by accusations of witchcraft or incompetence. Some women in towns took on work as servants, maids, or wet nurses. Young girls were often sent into service in wealthier households, where they cleaned, cooked, and cared for children. These positions provided food, shelter, and sometimes wages, but they also exposed women to vulnerability. Servants could be mistreated, exploited, or dismissed without cause. Wet nursing, in particular, carried both opportunity and stigma. Poor women might nurse the children of the wealthy for pay, but this meant leaving their own children at risk of neglect. The arrangement provided income but reinforced class divisions, where the labor of poor women's bodies supported the comfort of the rich. Prostitution formed another part of women's work beyond the home, though it carried heavy social consequences. Prostitution was widespread in medieval Europe and often tolerated or regulated by towns. Brothels were sometimes managed by municipalities, and women working in them were subject to rules, taxes, and restrictions. For many poor women, prostitution was one of the few ways to earn money independently, though it came at the cost of social shame, legal vulnerability, and physical danger. Prostitutes were excluded from many aspects of communal life, treated as necessary but despised. Their existence underscored the limited choices available to women who lacked family or resources. In noble households, women's work outside the private sphere often meant managing estates. Noble women, particularly when their husbands were away on military campaigns, took on responsibility for overseeing lands, collecting rents, and managing servants. Some acted as regents for underage sons, wielding significant power temporarily. Yet, even here, their authority was understood as delegated rather than their own. A noblewoman could be praised for her skill in managing an estate, but once her son or husband returned, her role was reduced again. Her work beyond the home was tolerated only as long as it fit within male frameworks of authority. Women's labor beyond the home was often invisible in records. Legal documents, guild charters, and chronicles tended to emphasize men's roles, leaving women's contributions unacknowledged. Yet, we know from fragmentary evidence, wills, court records, account books, that women were deeply involved in economic life. They sold goods in markets, lent money, ran taverns, and produced crafts. Their work was everywhere, but it was rarely given equal recognition or protection. When women did succeed visibly, they often attracted resentment. A woman who ran a profitable business might be accused of pride, greed, or worse. Success could be as dangerous as failure in a society determined to keep women subordinate. Migration for work was limited but not unheard of. Some women moved to towns seeking opportunities as servants, spinners, or prostitutes. Others followed armies as camp followers, cooking, washing, and providing services to soldiers. These forms of work were precarious and stigmatized, but they represented survival strategies for women who lacked support in their home communities. The freedom these roles offered came with immense risks, exposure to violence, disease, and exploitation. Still, they provided a way for women to move beyond the rigid confines of village life, even if only temporarily. Religious life also offered work beyond the home. Nuns in convents produced manuscripts, managed estates, and educated young girls. Some convents became centers of female economic activity, producing textiles, brewing, and renting lands. Abbesses could wield significant power, managing wealth and resources on behalf of their communities. Yet even here, their authority remained within boundaries set by male oversight. Bishops and priests supervised convents, and women's work in religious life was often praised only when it reinforced ideals of chastity and obedience. The common thread across all these forms of labor was precariousness. Women worked beyond the home in countless ways, but their roles were always conditional, fragile, and subject to suspicion. They could not claim equal recognition in guilds. They could not guarantee protection from exploitation. They could not rely on the law to defend their economic independence. Their labor was necessary but undervalued, visible but invisible, praised when it supported men and condemned when it seemed too ambitious. What emerges from this picture is not the absence of female labor beyond the home but its overwhelming vulnerability. Women were essential to agriculture, crafts, trade, and services, yet their participation was framed as secondary, tolerated only when it did not threaten male dominance. A woman who spun thread at home was seen as dutiful, a woman who ran a workshop might be accused of overstepping. A midwife could be respected until a birth went wrong, and then she became a witch. A servant might be trusted until accused of theft or impropriety. Every opportunity carried risks, and every form of independence was shadowed by suspicion. In this way, medieval women's work beyond the home illustrates the paradox of their lives. They were indispensable to the functioning of society, yet they were denied recognition and autonomy. Their labor supported households, towns, and economies, but it did not grant them freedom. Instead, it reinforced a system that relied on women's contributions while ensuring those contributions remained undervalued and controlled. To step beyond the home was to step into a world of opportunity laced with danger, a world where survival required not only skill and endurance but also constant negotiation of reputation, expectation, and vulnerability. If a medieval woman managed to live into old age, she had already defied the odds. Survival past childhood was uncertain, surviving repeated pregnancies was uncertain, and surviving disease, famine, and violence was uncertain. The average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was low, not because people always died young, but because so many died early. For women in particular, the dangers of childbirth and overwork cut lives short. Those who lived into their 40s, 50s, or beyond carried both the physical marks of survival and the social weight of old age in a world that had little patience for women who were no longer young, fertile, or tied to husbands. Aging was therefore both a relief and a new form of hardship. The physical toll of medieval life left women old before their time. Years of labor, poor diets, and repeated childbirths wore the body down quickly. A woman in her 40s might look and feel like a woman of 70 today. Teeth decayed or fell out early, bones ached from arthritis or injuries never properly treated, and eyes failed from years of sewing, spinning, or working in dim firelight. Menopause brought relief from the dangers of childbirth, but it did not remove the burden of work. Older women were still expected to cook, clean, spin, tend children, and help with farm labor if they were able. Age did not bring retirement in the modern sense. It simply meant doing the same tasks with a weaker body. Socially, older women's lives shifted depending on whether they were married, widowed, or single. Married older women remained under their husband's authority, but the dynamic often changed. Fertility had been one of the central measures of a woman's worth, and when that ended, she was seen differently. Some husbands treated aging wives with more respect, recognizing their shared years and the wisdom they brought. Others turned to younger mistresses or new marriages if widowed, leaving older women pushed aside. Widows, meanwhile, experienced both opportunity and vulnerability. The death of a husband could grant a woman more legal independence, especially if she inherited land or property. Some widows became heads of households, running farms or businesses, managing estates, and making decisions for families. But widowhood also exposed women to exploitation. Male relatives might pressure them to remarry, steal property, or challenge their rights in court. A wealthy widow might be pursued less for herself than for the inheritance she carried. A poor widow might be left destitute, relying on charity or struggling to survive. For women without children, old age could be particularly hard. Children often provided the only security in later years, taking in aging parents and ensuring food and shelter. Women who were childless or estranged from their families had few options. They might become servants in other households, depend on neighbors, or beg for survival. In towns, some older women found places in hospitals or almshouses, institutions that provided minimal care for the poor and elderly. These were not hospitals in the modern sense but charitable institutions tied to churches or wealthy patrons. Life in such places was austere, with limited food and strict discipline, but for women without support, it was often the only refuge. The perception of elderly women in medieval society was deeply shaped by cultural and religious beliefs. Youth and fertility were valued, while age was often viewed with suspicion. Older women were sometimes respected as wise, especially if they had large families and long experience of life. Grandmothers played important roles in passing on oral traditions, caring for grandchildren, and advising younger women. Their knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and household management could be invaluable. But at the same time, older women were also vulnerable to negative stereotypes. They were sometimes seen as quarrelsome, bitter, or dangerous. The figure of the old crone emerged in folklore, associated with gossip, meddling, or witchcraft. A woman who lived too long, especially without family protection, could be accused of unnatural powers. These suspicions were not harmless. As the fears of witchcraft grew during the later Middle Ages, older women became frequent targets. Widows living alone, women who owned cats or practiced herbal medicine, and those who survived while others suffered were all easy scapegoats. The frailty of old age, combined with social marginalization, made these women vulnerable. They were less able to defend themselves physically or legally, and they often lacked allies. In communities looking for someone to blame, the elderly woman on the edge of the village became an obvious target. Economically, aging narrowed women's options further. Many forms of labor available to younger women, such as service, brewing, or market work, required physical strength. Spinning and small-scale textile work remained possible, but the income was meager. Some older women acted as caregivers, assisting in childbirth or tending sick neighbors. Their knowledge was valued, though rarely well compensated. In noble households, older women might remain as advisors or respected matriarchs, but even here their influence depended on the goodwill of sons or male relatives. Age brought neither financial independence nor security. Religiously, old age was often framed as a time for piety and preparation for death. The Church encouraged the elderly to withdraw from worldly concerns and focus on prayer, confession, and charity. Older women were expected to model humility and devotion, to accept suffering as part of God's plan, and to prepare their souls for the afterlife. Some widows entered convents late in life, seeking security and spiritual comfort. Convents offered food, shelter, and community, though entry often required a dowry or financial contribution. For those who could not afford it, piety was expressed through local parish life, where older women might attend daily services, light candles, and join confraternities devoted to saints. This religious framing gave meaning to aging but also reinforced the idea that older women's main role was passive devotion rather than active participation in society. Community attitudes toward aging women varied. Some were cherished as repositories of wisdom, storytellers, or keepers of tradition. They played roles in teaching children prayers, songs, and folktales, ensuring cultural continuity. Others, however, were marginalized, especially if they became burdensome. Poverty, disability, and dependence often led to resentment. Neighbors might whisper about older women who needed too much help, framing them as lazy or greedy. In a society where survival required constant labor, those who could no longer contribute fully were seen as liabilities. Despite these challenges, aging also brought some relief. For women past childbearing years, the fear of death in childbirth was gone. The demands of nursing infants and chasing toddlers diminished. With adult children taking on more responsibilities, some older women experienced lighter workloads. They could devote more time to grandchildren, community, or religious devotion. Some found joy in storytelling, weaving, or small acts of charity. These were not freedoms in the modern sense, but they offered small compensations for decades of hardship. The contradictions of aging in the Middle Ages reflected the contradictions of women's lives as a whole. Women were essential to survival, yet undervalued. They were praised for obedience, yet blamed for sin. They were cherished as mothers, yet forgotten as widows. Old age magnified these contradictions. It could bring respect in one context and suspicion in another, security for some and destitution for others. For many, it was a period of endurance, marked by physical decline, limited options, and the hope of spiritual reward in the afterlife. When we look at old age for medieval women, what stands out most is the precariousness. Everything depended on circumstance, whether a husband lived or died, whether children survived to adulthood, whether property was inherited or stolen, whether communities valued or rejected them. Aging did not guarantee wisdom, comfort, or security. It was another stage of survival, shaped by the same vulnerabilities that marked women's lives from birth to death. The difference was that in old age, those vulnerabilities became sharper because women's bodies grew weaker and their social value, as defined by fertility and obedience, diminished. To survive to old age was to carry scars, literal and metaphorical. It meant living through plagues, famines, wars, and losses. It meant enduring decades of labor, childbirth, and subordination. It meant losing friends, children, and husbands, while continuing to work and endure. It meant becoming part of a small minority of women who lived long enough to see grandchildren grow, to remember events younger generations had never witnessed, and to face death with an accumulation of both suffering and resilience. Old age did not erase hardship, but it testified to endurance.